Welcome to See Crime Stories, true stories of the missing and the pursuit of answers. Thanksgiving, 2018. Woodland Park, Colorado. A 29-year-old flight instructor named Kelsey Barrett pushes a cart through the entrance of a Safeway. Midday light, ordinary traffic, nothing that reads as danger. The camera's timecode becomes our first anchor, the last confirmed sighting of a young mother whose phone will later light up hundreds of miles away. We start with what can be verified. The store's cameras bracket her arrival and exit. Cash register data confirms a small purchase. A child with her, a quick errand, then the door closes behind them and the frame goes quiet. For investigators, this is the opening frame of a missing person case with no body, no immediate crime scene, and no 911 call to inherit. In cases like this, the image becomes the witness that does not forget. The first days matter. Texts to family aren't returned. A message to her employer says she won't be in. Family call patterns and holiday routines, normally consistent, flatten out. That absence isn't feeling, it's behavioral variance measured against known habits. Missing person work in a small town starts with the simple questions: did she leave by choice, did someone take her, or is there a third path we haven't mapped yet? The data aligned too cleanly, and sometimes that was the problem. From the store outward, the search expands. Detectives capture the exact timestamps from the Safeway system and pull adjacent business cameras along the route to her condo. They verify vehicle make, model, and direction of travel where possible, and mark gaps where cameras don't reach. This is surveillance triangulation. You lock what you can see, then use those points to test what you're told. Friends and family provide the baseline: work schedule, childcare handoffs, recent stressors. Nothing in that early set grants permission to guess. The working assumption remains unknown cause, high risk. With no signs of forced entry reported, no public disturbance, and no immediate trace of flight, investigators keep the lens wide and the language tight. Last seen at Safeway, November 22, 2018. What makes the footage potent is not the image itself, but what it allows next. Time anchors unlock phone records, cell site pings, and geofence possibilities. If a device moved after the last sighting, the timecode provides the T04 comparing tower hits. If a vehicle passed an ALPR reader up or down Highway 24, the window is already set. In a nobody case, sequence is evidence. Kelsey's errand should have blended into a holiday afternoon. Instead, that door camera becomes the hinge on which everything turns. You can stand in that entryway even now and see how ordinary it is. That is what makes it effective. No chase, no fight, no warning. Just a frame that says she was here, and a long stretch of silence after. Kelsey Barrett's life ran on routine. Flight instruction shifts were logged. Childcare handoffs were predictable. Family calls followed a pattern. That baseline is where investigators started, because in a missing person case the first question isn't why, it's when the pattern breaks, and how we know it did. In the days around Thanksgiving 2018, that pattern broke cleanly. After the Safeway footage on November 22nd, there were no answered calls to family members who normally heard from her every day. Calendar entries weren't updated. Banking activity paused. None of those facts prove a crime, but taken together they mark an abnormal event. The early team documented each deviation as a fixed point: last in-person visual at the store, last confirmed outgoing call before the holiday, last normal text thread. Every timestamp became a reference for what came next. The first reliable anomaly was a message to her employer, sent from her phone, stating she wouldn't be in. It landed wrong with the people who knew her schedule. Supervisors and relatives described her as reliable, even meticulous. So investigators treated the message as data, not an explanation. Who typed it, where, and under what circumstances would be addressed later. In towns like Woodland Park, a quiet text can make more noise than a shouted warning. Detectives then built a practical map of her movements between the store and the condo. They confirmed the vehicle associated with her, checked parking at the property, and noted there was no recorded disturbance, no 911 call, no neighbors reporting a struggle. That kept the case balanced on a narrow line: high-risk missing, unknown cause. The absence of overt violence didn't mean safety, it meant the timeline would have to do the heavy lifting. Friends and family interviews were focused and consistent. When was the last real-time conversation? What words were used? Did she mention travel, illness, or conflict? Notes from those interviews were pared down to facts that could be tested against records, call durations, text periods, and planned appointments. The idea was simple: remove opinion, isolate behavior. The more the baseline is known, the less room there is for guesswork. Inside the condo, the initial look did not generate a clear alert. That's common. Early welfare checks are not full forensic searches, and standard walkthroughs are limited in scope by both law and training. The team logged what they could see, preserved what could be preserved, and documented access points for a potential return with warrants and tools designed for trace work. No dramatic declarations, just a promise in the log to come back with the right kid if the case pointed there. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Digital life is part of the baseline now. Investigators moved quickly to secure provider records that would later matter: carrier logs, device identifiers, and app activity windows. They didn't publish conclusions, they preserved perishable evidence before it could roll off retention cycles. A missing person file that respects the timeline in the first 72 hours gives prosecutors the spine of a case months later. It also prevents avoidable gaps. When a loved one disappears without an obvious scene, the record becomes the scene. There was a human reality under all of this: a young mother gone quiet after a holiday errand. That matters because communities measure danger by distance to the familiar. When routine collapses without explanation, the safest option is to treat the silence as a red flag, not an inconvenience. The job is not to sensationalize the fear. The job is to document facts that will hold under scrutiny. By the end of the first phase, the case had a working frame. Last seen in person at the supermarket on November 22nd. No confirmed voice contact afterward. A text to an employer that did not sound like her established habits. No immediate reports of a disturbance at the home. No financial activity that suggested voluntary flight. Nothing yet that proved foul play, but enough to justify every next step: a tighter chronological reconstruction and a deeper dive into her devices. The question for an investigator becomes simple: if the public last saw her in a clear, time-stamped video, what's the first data point that should light up after that? Home entry timestamps, nearby camera hits, or a phone that continues to move? Answering that will push the case forward in a straight line and keep it from splitting into two stories that don't match. The case moved when the phone moved. Provider records showed Kelsey Barrett's device connecting to towers that did not belong to Woodland Park. After Thanksgiving 2018, the handset's activity shifted north and west, stepping from Colorado onto towers in southern Idaho. The first reliable hit came roughly 3 days after the Safeway sighting. That single change expanded the search by hundreds of miles and reframed the risk. We were no longer asking only where she went after the supermarket, we were asking who was carrying her phone and why. Here's how investigators worked it. They locked the Safeway timestamps from November 22nd and pulled the carrier's call detail records and cell site lists for Kelsey's line. A phone ping is not a GPS, it's a connection to a nearby tower with a known coverage area. When you plot those towers in order, you see a route. In this file, the route left Colorado. That is unusual for a young mother with no documented plan to travel on that weekend. It didn't convict anyone, it told detectives where to look next. The Idaho hit centered near Gooding and Twin Falls. Teams contacted local agencies, requested any relevant traffic cams, and scanned plate reader data on the corridors in and out. They asked for card activity tied to the same dates, not because a card would prove who had the phone, but because real travel tends to leave parallel traces: fuel purchases, rest stop cameras, motel check-ins. When those didn't materialize under Kelsey's name, the working theory narrowed. Either she traveled with someone else who paid for the trip, or her phone traveled without her. Text traffic from her number after Thanksgiving was examined alongside the tower changes. Messages sent to her employer and family helped bracket time windows, but the content took a back seat to the routing, what network handled the messages, which towers they used, and how those facts matched or broke from her normal pattern. When a message that reads like her voice is delivered from an unexpected place, investigators do not argue about tone, they document the geography and ask who physically had the device at that moment. Back in Woodland Park, the team stayed disciplined. They did not broadcast the Idaho connection immediately. Announcing the jump too early risks sending copycats or well-meaning volunteers down bad roads. Instead, they quietly cross-referenced the tower sequence with any phone numbers that traveled with Kelsey's device for long stretches, companions on the network, even if only for a few miles. It's a simple logic: phones that move together see the same towers in the same order. When two devices share a route at matching times, the pool of possible carriers shrinks. There was also the home front to consider. If Kelsey's phone was in Idaho, what stayed in Colorado? Detectives pulled records for her condo's access points, checked with management about any key logs or maintenance entries, and compared those dates to the device trail. A legitimate trip usually leaves behind a conversation, a plan, or a pickup time. The silence before and after the Idaho movement read as a red flag. In small towns, people notice when plans change. No one noticed such a plan here. The Idaho focus wasn't a fishing expedition. It produced names and places that could be verified. Investigators made discreet contact with people Kelsey knew who lived or worked in that region, if any, and then widened out to associates of her Colorado circle who had Idaho ties. The goal was to understand whether the phone's route could be explained by an innocent errand. If it could, the case would adjust. If it couldn't, the phone had become a tool for misdirection. We kept the human frame in view. A missing person with a child does not simply go off the grid and hand her digital life to chance. That is not a judgment, it is an observation grounded in patterns. When families watch this kind of case unfold, they often ask why police care so much about phone towers. It's because in the absence of a clear scene, the device becomes the scene. Towers gave us sequence. Sequence gave us probable direction of travel. And that pointed the investigation to a small set of roads where cameras and witnesses could still be found. By the end of this phase, two truths sat side by side. Truth 1. Kelsey was last verified on camera at a Woodland Park supermarket on November 22, 2018. Truth 2. Her phone registered in Idaho days later. Those truths do not cancel each other. They draw a line between them and ask who, and what, crossed it. The next steps would follow that line, identifying the carriers who moved in sync with her device and the person who admitted to handling it after she vanished. The motive could wait. The path could not. A brief note for anyone who has lived through a disappearance in their own town: precision matters. When you hear ping, think radius, not bullseye. When you hear route, think timed segments between towers, not a perfectly traced map. What matters is the chain. If the same numbers appear again and again near the victim's device, you are not looking at coincidence, you are looking at proximity that can be tested. The second look was not a welfare check. Detectives came back to Kelsey Barrett's Woodland Park condo with a signed warrant, a methodical search plan, and a short list of targets, entry points, bathroom surfaces, flooring seams, and items that would hold trace material even after routine cleaning. The goal was simple: decide whether this was just a missing person residence or the scene of a violent crime. They started with documentation. Exterior photos, door hardware, and any sign of forced entry. None stood out. Inside, the team worked room by room, photographing before touching anything, logging the order of collection, and sealing each item. Chain of custody is not bureaucracy, it is the only way those items mean anything in court months later. Swabs went to high-touch areas first: light switches, handles, the baby gate, and bathroom fixtures. Floors were screened with alternate light sources and then tested in areas where seams or baseboards could trap residue. On upholstery, technicians lifted small cuttings rather than entire cushions to preserve context. Nothing about the process was dramatic. It was slow and controlled because the absence of an obvious struggle placed extra weight on trace findings. What emerged was a pattern consistent with an assault contained inside the home, not an accident and not a voluntary departure. Stains were not the focus, distribution was. A mark on a vertical surface matters differently than one on a floor, and a set of small, separated hits along a baseboard tells a different story than a single spill. The collection notes reflected that. This was not about proving cause of death, there was no body. It was about proving violence occurred where she lived. The team looked beyond visible residue. They cataloged cleaning products on hand, noted the state of trash receptacles, and checked drains. If someone tried to remove evidence, that attempt has its own footprint, items out of place, supplies used in odd sequence, or drains that fluoresce where they shouldn't. Again, nothing theatrical, just a record that can be compared to later testimony about what happened in those rooms. Device checks inside the condo were equally practical. Routers and smart plugs sometimes retain logs. If a vacuum docked at 2 a.m., if lights toggled at unusual hours, those facts can bracket events. Investigators imaged what they were authorized to collect and left what the warrant didn't cover. Quiet discipline matters. It prevents a defense from arguing that the search exceeded its scope. Neighbors were re-interviewed with the new time windows in mind. The question was no longer, did you see her? It was, did you hear anything between these hours? A thud, a loud television, a dog that barked longer than usual, small signals can confirm a window of activity. No one reported a 911 call. No one described a fight in the hall. That silence, paired with the trace inside, focused the case. Whatever happened likely happened fast and inside the unit. By late day, the collection plan was complete. The apartment was rephotographed, and the evidence was transported under seal to the lab. Detectives did not announce findings. They do not need the public to know how much was recovered. They need the lab to say whether human blood is present, whether it matches the victim's profile, and whether the pattern in the room matches the sequence suggested by the phone data and the last confirmed sighting. Evidence has to talk to evidence. What made this rebound search effective is what it avoided. Investigators did not guess at motive. They did not label suspects on camera. They did not overstate what swabs can prove. They built a narrow bridge, a condo that now reads as a crime scene, a phone that left the state, a woman who did not return to her routine or her child. In cases like this, the humane choice is precision. Families deserve answers that hold up, not theories that fall apart. There is a broader lesson in how small agencies do this right. A welfare check is a snapshot, a forensic search is a sequence. The first preserves possibility. The second tests it. When you keep those steps separate and document the gap between them, you don't end up with two stories that contradict each other. You end up with one story that gets clearer as the work gets better. For the viewer who has followed missing person cases in your own town, you know the toll silence takes. A measured search like this one is not cold, it is careful. It allows a prosecutor, a year later, to point to a photograph and a lab result and say, this is where it happened, even when a body has not been found. That is how a no-body case moves from uncertainty to chargeable. The interstate phone trail raised a simple test. If Kelsey Barrett's device left Colorado, did it travel alone? Carrier records let investigators stack timelines, tower by tower, looking for other phones that rode the same path within the same minutes. Most overlaps are noise, holiday traffic, random proximity. But patterns are stubborn. One number kept appearing near the same towers across southern Idaho, matching hops with Kelsey's phone more than once. That wasn't chance, it was a companion. Detectives pulled the corridor cameras they hadn't touched yet, fuel stops on the route into Twin Falls, a parking lot near a big box store, a frontage road camera that caught vehicles at low speed. Nothing was cinematic, but the time codes lined up with the carrier logs. When the companion device approached a retail strip, Kelsey's phone lit the same sector. When the companion left, her phone followed. Two devices, one route. The next step was quiet. Subpoena returns confirmed the subscriber behind the companion number had an Idaho address. The team didn't stage a televised knock. They scheduled an interview where they could ask clean questions and preserve whatever answers came back. The focus was narrow. On these dates, were you in this area? Did you have any contact, direct or indirect, with Kelsey? Did you handle a phone that wasn't yours? The goal wasn't to shame or speculate, it was to map hands to objects. Before that conversation, investigators checked what else moved in sync with the devices. License plate readers on the corridor flagged a vehicle tied to the Idaho subscriber within the same windows the phones traveled. The make and model matched what a fuel stop camera had captured in profile. That convergence, 2 phones and a car, gave detectives enough to treat the person, and not just the phone, as relevant. In missing person work, you don't accuse a device, you verify the carrier. Back in Colorado, the condo results were still being processed, but the search there had already reframed the case from welfare check to probable violence inside. Now the Idaho lead offered a way to explain the most confusing piece of early data, why Kelsey's phone registered far from home without parallel signs that she had traveled. The working theory tightened. Someone moved the device to Idaho. The only open questions were who asked for that favor, and what the mover knew about the days after Thanksgiving. The interview went into the record. The Idaho woman acknowledged possession of a phone that wasn't hers during the post-holiday window. She described being asked to carry it out of state and to send messages to make it appear the owner was still active. She also admitted driving to Colorado around that time at someone else's request. Those statements didn't resolve motive or identity of the person giving directions, and they didn't answer the hardest question, what happened inside the condo, but they did something essential in a no-body case. They connected the misleading digital trail to a human hand. Investigators tested what she said against the paperwork. Her mileage and receipts from the trip didn't tell a full story, but they didn't contradict the core claim either. Traffic cameras placed her car where she said it was. The phone's tower sequences matched her timeline. Even her description of where she parked during one stop found support on a low-resolution camera that caught the shape of her vehicle at the edge of frame. Small confirmations matter. They keep the case from splitting into competing narratives later. The woman also described entering the Colorado condo. She said she was asked to clean, to remove anything that looked like it didn't belong. She named rooms, mentioned surfaces, and identified a few items she believed she touched. That account didn't broadcast to the public. It went straight against the lab's checklist from the warrant-backed search: exact areas swabbed, fixtures documented, materials preserved. If her description overlapped with where trace was found, the story got stronger. If it didn't, the story got weaker. Either way, the test was objective. For families, this is the part of the case that feels impossible. How could someone carry a loved one's phone, send messages, and drive away? The answer isn't comfort, it's clarity. In cases built without a body, the path to court runs through people who admit to small roles in a larger plan, roles that explain why the digital trail looked like life when life had already stopped. It's not about sympathy for the helper. It's about establishing that the phone movement was misdirection, not proof the victim walked away. By the end of this phase, the story no longer relied on towers alone. It had a person who said she moved the phone, a car that rode the same corridor, and statements about a trip into Colorado that matched independent logs. The circle tightened around the questions that would define the second half of the series: who directed the trip, why the condo needed to be cleaned, and how the axe in Colorado connected to a burn site investigators would later examine. We were not naming a defendant yet. We were naming conduct, because conduct is what juries can hold. There is a human line worth saying out loud. In missing person cases, the first lie is often digital. A text sent from the wrong place. A phone that crosses a border while the person who once held it does not. When communities learn to spot that lie early, they demand the right work from the start: preserve the devices, build the routes, and find the hand that carried the phone. That is how no body becomes a body of proof. The rural property wasn't chosen for a spectacle. Detectives went because the route maps, phone overlaps, and the Idaho interview pointed there. A search team entered with a focused plan: document any area consistent with a controlled burn, recover what survived heat, and record the layout so a jury could later see the ground as it was found, not as anyone wished it to be. They located a metal stock trough set away from the main structures. The soil around it showed discoloration and an outline wider than a normal trash fire. Investigators photographed every angle, measured the footprint, and sifted the ash layer by layer. This is slow work. You crouch, you screen, you stop every few minutes to bag tiny items that matter only when they are read together. No guessing, no speeches, just a catalog that can be defended under oath. What came out of the trough was ordinary and disturbing at the same time: melted aluminum, metal fasteners that could belong to storage bins, bits of wire, glass marbles from decorative items that do not melt at low temperatures, and char consistent with a petroleum accelerant. None of that identifies a person. But it does describe heat and intent to reduce material to fragment. From the ash near the trough slip, technicians recovered a small, hard object that didn't look like slag. It went into its own envelope, labeled at the scene. In the lab, that item presented characteristics of a human tooth fragment. It was not the whole story, and it was not a full identification. Heat damages DNA, enamel protects structure more than genetic material. The result was what it often is in cases like this: limited, cautious, and still probative. You can't say who the fragment belonged to. You can say that a fragment like that should not be in a burn trough behind a private ranch. The key was how the burn site lined up with everything gathered so far. The Idaho witness who admitted carrying the victim's phone had already described a trip to Colorado and a request to clean. She also named a rural property connected to the inner circle. Now, evidence teams were standing on that ground, photographing the very trough she had indirectly led them to. That's corroboration. Not of motive yet, but of movement, access, and a plan to erase. Detectives widened the perimeter. Soil samples were taken outward from the trough to establish gradients of heat effect. A drag of the nearby field turned up nothing that changed the case, which was its own data point. If destruction happened here, it was focused and contained. A few burned fragments that might once have been part of a larger plastic container were recovered along the prevailing wind side, consistent with discarding or repositioning material as it cooled. Again, nothing dramatic, but consistent with the goal to reduce evidence. They did what the best teams do next: they drew the line on paper. Last confirmed public sighting on a holiday afternoon at a supermarket. Phone behavior that leaves Colorado days later. A condo that reads, under warrant, as the site of violence. An Idaho participant who admits handling the phone and entering the home. And now a burn location with a trough and a fragment that looks like a tooth. No single point answers the case alone. Together, they start to remove alternatives. There's an ethical part to saying this out loud. Families want remains home. This work cannot offer that. What it can offer is clarity that holds up. When a community hears no body, it can sound like no case. That isn't true if the record is strong, the science is honest about its limits, and the story the evidence tells is one story from start to finish. That's the standard here. One narrative, built piece by piece. By the time the search team cleared the property, every bag was sealed, every step photographed, and the trough was logged as a central exhibit. The case didn't leap forward because of a confession. It moved because a field in Colorado matched a phone map from Idaho and a statement about cleanup that never should have been needed. Cases collapse when pieces don't talk to each other. This one held because the pieces began to say the same thing. Detectives laid out a wall chart, Safeway timestamps from November 22, 2018, the behavioral baseline that went silent, the cell site path into Idaho, the warrant-backed condo findings, the Idaho interview, and the burn site catalog. The task was simple and strict: link each point with an independent record or put a line through it. First, the Idaho witness. She said she handled a phone that wasn't hers, carried it out of Colorado, and sent messages to make it look like the owner was still around. Carrier logs showed Kelsey Barrett's device stepping towers toward southern Idaho on the days she named. A second number, tied to the witness, mirrored those hops. License plate readers caught her car in that corridor during the same windows. Fuel stop video showed a vehicle consistent with hers on the same dates. For independent items, 2 phones, a car, and a camera corroborated movement before anyone talks about intent. Next, the condo. The witness described entering the Woodland Park unit to clean. She identified rooms and surfaces she believed she wiped. The search warrant return listed trace collections from those same areas. Lab memos confirmed human blood was detected in select swabs. The distribution fit an in-home assault, not a routine spill. There was no guesswork in the comparison. A grid from her statement overlaid the grid from the lab. Overlap matters. It narrows what cleaning means and when it happened. Then the rural property. Without prompting, the witness referenced a ranch location linked to the inner circle. Teams documented a metal stock trough, ash consistent with a sustained burn, and debris that included a fragment with the characteristics of a human tooth. The lab's cautious language stayed in place, limited identification, DNA likely compromised by heat, but the geography lined up. The person who carried the phone named a place, and that place yielded heat-altered remains. That is not two stories, it is one chain. Timeline pressure points were tested the same way. The last confirmed public sighting sits at midday on Thanksgiving. Messages sent later from Kelsey's phone route through towers nowhere near Woodland Park. There is no credible evidence she traveled under her own plan, no airfare, no hotel, no card use, during that period. Meanwhile, the condo shows signs of a rapid event and a later cleanup. The rural property shows a focused burn. The sequence is tight even without a body. It reads like a plan executed in parts. Investigators also ran a negative check, facts that would have broken the line if they existed. A verified voice call from Kelsey after the store? Absent. Video of her outside Woodland Park that weekend? Absent. A neighbor account of a voluntary departure? Absent. Negative results aren't a shortcut, they're guardrails that keep a jury from wandering into speculation. What remains human in a file this clinical is the reason communities expect this kind of work, truth that holds. The words we think don't belong in court. The words we can show do. Here, the case moves because showing wins, showing a phone that left, a home that bled, a trough that burned, and a witness who placed herself in the middle of those facts. It isn't about punishing every mistake a helper made, it's about using her statements to explain why the digital trail looked alive when it wasn't. By the end of this phase, detectives could stand in front of the chart and draw one line from the Thanksgiving sighting to the burn trough without lifting the marker. That line doesn't name a defendant yet. It does make the next step unavoidable, converting a narrative of movement and cleanup into charges that match the evidence. The file that reached the DA wasn't a theory, it was a sequence. Safeway on Thanksgiving. A daily routine that went silent. A handset that left Colorado for Idaho. A condo that read, under warrant, as the site of violence. An Idaho participant who admitted carrying the phone and cleaning the home. A rural burn trough yielding heat-altered debris and a fragment consistent with a human tooth. Each piece stood on its own, and together they closed the alternatives. On that record, Colorado issued an arrest warrant for Patrick Frazee. Charges centered on first-degree murder, solicitation, and evidence tampering, each count tied to dates, places, and preserved exhibits. The state didn't argue motive in headlines, it mapped conduct. Meanwhile, Crystal Lee Kinney formalized cooperation. She acknowledged transporting Kelsey Barrett's phone to Idaho, sending messages to mislead, traveling to Colorado, and cleaning targeted surfaces in the Woodland Park condo. Her account was not taken on faith. It matched carrier logs, license plate hits, corridor cameras, and the lab's collection grid. At trial, prosecutors presented the case the way it was built: timeline first, scene work second, corroboration third. The defense leaned on absence, no recovered body, no confession from the accused, and a cooperator with exposure. The state answered with presence, authenticated video at Safeway, post-holiday device activity hundreds of miles away from the victim's life, documented trace in the condo, a named participant whose travel, devices, and tasks tracked independent records, and a controlled burn location whose contents made voluntary disappearance untenable. Beyond a reasonable doubt came from how the parts agreed without borrowing from each other. In November 2019, the jury found Patrick Frazee guilty of first-degree murder and related counts. The court imposed life without parole, plus 156 years for the additional crimes. As of today, Kelsey Barrett's remains have not been recovered. The judgment stands because the chain holds careful search, disciplined lab work, honest limits on science, and a witness anchored to verifiable facts. There is a human point worth keeping. Phones can pretend someone is alive, patterns cannot. Welfare checks protect possibilities, warrants test them. If you see signs of coercion or disappearance in your circle, report early, records fade quickly, and early documentation saves cases. I've learned this the hard way. Phones can pretend someone is alive, patterns can't. When a routine breaks, speak up early. Document, check on neighbors, and take protection orders seriously. Justice in nobody cases is built from careful records and people who refuse to look away. What stood out to you in Kelsey's case? Do you agree with how investigators built the chain? Why or why not? Tell me where you're watching from. If this story missed for you, say why. If it moved you, please subscribe to see crime stories and join us for the next case.